Three, two, one, here we go. Hello, everyone. I'm Brian the Rain Man Lucas. Welcome to Rain Man's Take, observations on the world we live in. We're going to take a deeper dive into topics of interest to me, including politics, current events, history, popular culture, and social issues. You'll find the diversity of topics refreshing. In our clickbait, soundbite society, we rarely get the whole story. Rain Man's Take interviews interesting people as well as peeling back the onion on specific topics, all with the goal of getting people to think more deeply about a subject. Hey everybody, it's the Rain Man. Welcome back. I want to introduce my guest, Joe Connell. Joe, how are you, sir?
Very well. Thank you very much, Brian, for having me on.
Oh, no problem. I'm really looking forward to our conversation. The reason why I wanted to have Joe on is he is an attorney by trade, but more of a well-known author. He's written 10 books, and he's got another one on the way sometime next year, all of them relating to the subject matter of kind of modern Irish history, starting from the uprising in Ireland in 1916, all the way through the Irish War of Independence. And then, so all of his books are based on that part of Ireland's history. But he also periodically, and actually more than periodically, on a regular basis, has a piece on a spot talking about Ireland's history. And so it's going to be a very interesting conversation to take the lessons learned from that part of Irish history, projected out over the last 100 years, in not only in Ireland, but also all of the insurgencies and the guerrilla wars that we've seen since then throughout the world. So, Joe, thanks again for joining me, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
So am I. And as I said to you earlier, because of your experience, particularly in the Marines and in the insurrections you've seen, I'll probably ask you as many questions you ask me, and I'm really interested in your answers.
Well, perfect. Well, I'm looking forward to that. And that actually is a couple of reasons. One, I'm half Irish on my mother's side. Her maiden name is O'Connor. I did an amazing trip around Ireland about 3 years ago. We basically circled the entire country, got a chance to see Ireland, Northern Ireland. It's just amazing. And then, like you said, just my experiences in the war in Iraq. So we're going to have a great conversation. Why don't we do this? Why don't you go ahead, and I know you don't like doing it, but give me a quick kind of 30,000-foot view of your life prior to starting to write these books and prior to getting interested in this part of Irish history.
Well, I was born in Colorado, but I went to school in California. And after I was in ROTC in college, as almost everybody in college in those days was, a long time ago, Brian. But everybody went into the Army at that time, and I did as well. I was in the Army for a short period of time. I was in the 82nd Airborne. And following leaving the Army, I went back and went to law school, as you mentioned a little bit earlier. And then I sort of semi-retired. I did a little bit of traveling, but mostly the last 20 years, I've been traveling throughout Ireland and trying to write about Ireland. One thing that's important to note about Ireland, and I suppose a lot of other places as well, Dublin, to me, when I first got there, I was playing some golf, I was walking around, I was very interested in history, but Dublin is really a battle site. It's just as much of a battleground as Waterloo or as Gettysburg is, and yet the people didn't seem to realize that. The books at the time in the late 1990s didn't really go into what happened where. And when I was walking around doing a lot of walking in those days, I would find buildings, I would find places where pubs were, meeting places, places where I would have put my people if I were in the offensive, people where I put my people if I were in the defensive. And I just looked at Dublin that way, and then everything kind of grew from there.
Yeah, that's fascinating that you say that, because two places in particular in Ireland or in Dublin that stuck out in my mind was there was and I don't recall, actually it was on the backside of the city, kind of where all the wharfs were. There's a restaurant there that still has bullet holes in the ceiling from some of the fighting that was going on, and it's kind of like a industrial kind of warehouse area. And then you go on the other side of the River Liffey and down kind of the main square there. And that was kind of where it all took place, right? Where the post office and all of that, where the major kind of start of that uprising occurred. And so, yeah, you're right. It's everywhere.
Yeah, 1916 was, it's looked upon really as a seminal event, I think, in Irish history at that time. And there are a great many buildings with bullet holes in them. There are a great many people, as I'm sure you went to a pub or two in Ireland. There are a great many places where the people will tell you there are bullet holes that there really are not bullet holes, and that's okay too. There's an awful lot of history there. There's an awful lot of stories about history there, and basically they're very proud people, and they're very proud of what happened. Sometimes, though, the history gets away from us all. When we read history, any one of us, you or me, when we started in secondary school, we thought this was all very, very complex, and we knew dates and we knew people, and we thought it was resolved. It's not.
Yeah.
100 years ago, as I write about it, there's material that's coming out now that we didn't know about 100 years ago that's totally changing our viewpoints of things. So I think when you look through history, you have to understand that it's very much of a dynamic. It changes all the time. Our information changes, our views change, and it's good to keep looking at what the newest and the trends are, but also where the old things came from, and were they right or were they wrong, or were they just opinions at the time?
Yeah, interesting. And that's, it kind of going back. So you got 1916, but for several hundred years before then, the English had kind of had their boot over Ireland, and they were constantly rebelling against it. And it's so. What are some? Are there anything that you can kind of dive into? Some new pieces of information that maybe we didn't know about before?
Sure. Since 2000, there have been several things that have happened. The War of Independence was 1919 and 1921. Then the Civil War was 1922 to 23. And after that, there were various places where information was written down, but it was preserved. And the Irish have various rules that you can't let information out for numbers of years. In 2003, for example, there were 1,700 witness statements of the period of 1913 to 1922 that were released. They were taken in the 40s and the 50s, but they couldn't be released until the last person who gave one passed away.
Interesting.
So you have a great deal of information that came in then. In 2014, we had a great many pension applications that people applied for pensions starting in the 20s, then the 30s, and then going on thereafter. And in their pension applications, they said what they did, where they did it, with whom they did it, that sort of thing.
Right.
One of the things I want to talk about here a great deal today, because I always want to make sure that they get credit, because they haven't been given credit, are the women. Women were not allowed to put in a pension until the later 1930s. Even those who fought in the Rising, even Margaret Skinner, who was wounded 3 times in the Rising, could not put in an application for a pension. That's one of the problems that we've had, that we're now starting to take a look at. What was the women's role? And it was known at the time, and these people deserve credit. Everyone deserves credit for what they did. There's a lady that, her name is Helena Maloney. She was an actress at the Abbey Theater. She was a fine actress, and she was just starting to come into her own as an actress, but she was very much of a Republican and very much of a revolutionary. She was asked one time about the women in the Rising. And she said something that I think is particularly important. She said, when you ask me what did a woman do in the Rising, you might as well ask me what did tall men do and what did small men do. They all did what came to their hands, and they did it as well as they could. But the women didn't get credit for what they did.
Kind of an all hands on deck type of a situation.
It absolutely was. Absolutely was.
Yeah,
There was a commander of finally the commander of the forces in the city hall. That was Kathleen Lynn, Dr. Kathleen Lynn, who went on to become very famous as the lady who, with her partner Madeline French Mullen, started the first children's hospital in Dublin. So all these people, they had tremendous roles, and they didn't get credit for it. And most of the time, they didn't get pensions for it either.
Interesting. Is that just because of a kind of a male-dominated society, or is it more nefarious than that? Were they like almost punishing them for it, or?
Isn't that nefarious enough?
Yeah, good point. Good point.
All right, let me put it to you this way: there was a meeting in Sligo, actually a group of lectures given in Sligo on the west coast of Ireland about 5 years ago, and I was asked to give a lecture there, but I was also asked to open the conference there. And the theme of the conference was that women were written out of history at the time, which was very true, and that was what my lecture was upon. However, my opening statement was that women were not just written out of history, they were attempted to be written out of society, and they were.
Interesting. And you also sent me another book as well that talks specifically about the women's role in this, called Unequal Patriots. But before we get going even further, Joe, you had mentioned it just briefly in the opening remarks there, but the book that we are talking about, this is his 10th book, called The Shadow War, Michael Collins and the Politics of Violence, and basically the precursor to the modern day guerrilla war tactics, insurgency tactics. Kind of going back to the first book you wrote, and it looks like it was in the early 2006. From how did that book come about? Was it your multiple trips over to Ireland? All of a sudden, you just started really, you're noticing that part of the Irish history is kind of not getting its due, and that's when you started writing, or how did that all come about, the first book in 2006?
I'm pretty obsessive compulsive, Brian. And so when I was walking around all the time, I was taking notes, and I had a notebook. It was a loose leaf notebook. It was very, very, very crude. But I used to go to the archives most afternoons and sit there and look at it. And I go back there year after year, and I knew some of the archivists there. And one of them was very kind, and she came over to me and she said, "Can I help you? What are you doing?" They thought I was in the wrong place. Basically, they thought that I was doing some genealogical research and I didn't know what I was doing. Now, I admit, and I will say that I didn't know what I was doing, but I showed her what I had. And at that point, it was simply the addresses, where things happened, who did what, where, and what was the combinations, all those sorts of things. It was not a planned thing at all. And she said, "We will put this on the shelf right now." And I said, "Well, is there anybody you think might want to even print this?" She sent me over to the city of Dublin, the library there, and Mary Clark, who was the archivist for the city of Dublin at that time, took that book, and that turned out to be the official Dublin publication for the 90th anniversary of the Rising in 2006. And everything's kind of flowed from there. It was certainly not a plan of mine, not by any chance.
Interesting. Yeah, and so is that first book, is it like kind of a walking tour? You can take it when you're walking around Dublin and kind of follow the events?
Yeah, I've done several books of that type, walking tours that can be that way. It kind of depends on the book. Some of them, for example, I have a book called Michael Collins Dublin, in which I specifically take a look at the places that you can find Collins and that sort of thing. So all of these books were, at the start, that's kind of what I did. But again, you would find a tremendous amount of information as what happened, but it was according to the place where it happened. The latest books that I've done, I've tried to just get away from that and more into the prose and the idea of the War of Independence itself and the things that happened in that.
Yeah. Just kind of sticking with the city of Dublin right now, one of the things you talk about in there is that the majority of the intelligence gathering, the propaganda focus, the violence primarily took place in the cities, because the countryside is sparsely populated, where it's kind of as I was taking notes, I just called it basically like a hornet's nest in downtown Dublin, because at the time you've got the English occupation forces in the city, and they're basically, it's a cat and mouse game to try to find out where the Irish are and where the English are, where can we hit them next? I mean, it is a cat and mouse, door to door almost of it. And that's really what you see in most of the modern insurgency, counterinsurgency. It's trying to weed out the bad guys from a general population in a very finite area.
Very true. Let me make a couple of points. First of all, there was an awful lot going on outside of Dublin. You're right. It was guerrilla war is always a local war, as you know. It's done by the individuals. It's done differently in different places. There was probably as much action in Cork, and there certainly was as much action in Belfast, more murders than there were in Dublin. But Dublin was the headquarters for the British, and it was certainly the headquarters for the Irish at the time. You mentioned the term cat and mouse, and I think it's very interesting to look at that, because there's something else that goes along with it. Very often, the Irish would go, and this applies not only to the men, but applies to the women. They would be arrested, and they would go on hunger strike. And in fact, then the British, after a few of the Irish died terribly on hunger strike, Terence McSweeney, for example, they would let the Irish go, and then they would wait until they recovered and rearrest them. And those were called the cat and mouse acts. So they would let the mouse go for a little while, wait till they got okay, rearrest them, and start over again.
God, it's crazy.
Yeah, it was.
The that whole hunger strike, that tactic has kind of played out with the Irish all the way through the 60s and the 70s and 80s. Because when we were there and we were in Northern Ireland, you see all the murals on the sides of the streets about, what was it, the H block, and I don't recall exactly where that prison was, but there was a massive hunger strike that took place there, and those people are all immortalized now. But that was the later the troubles that I think that those people were from. But I mean
it was. But let me go back here. The Irish had what were called Brehon laws way back when. 1000 BC, for example, they had these, and they were very, very good. They allowed great equality among people. Women were allowed divorce, for example, at that time. Women could own property, they could own cattle, and that sort of a thing. In the Brehon laws, one of the things that would happen was if someone had been offended, they would go sit on your doorstep, and you would have to take care of them. The idea of a hunger strike did not start just in Ireland in 1916 or in 1917. It was there all along, and a great many times it was done not just by the Irish, but among other people as well. It was done particularly by the suffragettes, not only again in Ireland, but in Britain in the early 1900s, where they went and they would starve themselves and that sort of thing. You may have recalled seeing a picture of a lady in 1913. Her name was Emily Davidson. It was the Epsom Derby in 1913. She ran onto the track for King George's horse, ran in front of it. The horse ran over her and she died. So the suffragists really were the ones who started the concept of hunger striking, and then it passed on to the Irish during the period of the World Revolution. Thomas Ashe died from forced feeding after hunger striking in 1917. And then Terence McSweeney was on hunger strike along with other people in Cork who also passed away, and he died in October of 1920. So it was something that was done. The general headquarters did not like this. They didn't want this. And as a matter of fact, after McSweeney killed himself, they said, don't do this anymore. We don't want this. Some of the people said it's better to fight for Ireland than it is to die for Ireland. But you're absolutely right. In the later troubles in the second half of the 20th century, in 1981, and then most particularly in 1982, there were hunger strikes in the north. And Bobby Sands was the one who probably you saw many murals of in Belfast. While he was on hunger strike, he was elected to the British Parliament, and then he died on hunger strike along with 10 other strikers up there. So this is something that, as so much of the time that you see, not just in terms of guerrilla war, not just in terms of terror, not just in terms of things, but you'll see the repetitive nature of things throughout the world as well. And you take a look throughout the world, there were Indian hunger strikers. There were hunger strikers all over the world. This is simply a tactic. When I have nothing else to give, I will give my life.
And it's actually very, very effective, because the propaganda impact of seeing that is pretty startling. It's pretty incredible.
In 1920, that was probably the death of Terence McSweeney on hunger strike in 1920 in Brixton Prison in London was worldwide news. And he died after 74 days, and it was a countdown. People actually would count the number of days. The newspapers would have it. It was a front page story throughout the world, the United States, France, throughout the world. So this is the kind of thing that takes off. Propaganda is extraordinarily important in any kind of a guerrilla war. It's military action, politics, and propaganda. If you don't have those three in some fashion, you're going to lose.
I want to just jump back real quick, because this is something that I'm very interested in, and I know why the English wanted to keep Belfast in Northern Ireland. Churchill wanted I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, but my impression or my understanding is Churchill wanted to at least keep that part of Ireland because of the wool and the shipyard, and they kind of acquiesced. They gave everything back to the Irish, except for that county, or those couple of counties that kind of circled around Belfast. Is that the case? And then how did that transition go after the War of Independence?
I'm smiling because the first word that I would question would be the word that the British gave. I'm not sure the British have ever given anything to anybody, so I would certainly question that word that you mentioned. Basically, what happened is that, again, going way back, going into the 16th century, going back before Cromwell, going back to King William of Orange, who came to fight the Jacobites and that sort of thing in the Battle of Boyne in 1690. You take a look at all these things, and they all have an effect. If you go to a 12th of July parade today in the North, you would see group after group after group carrying gigantic banners for King Billy of the War of the Battle of 1690 at the Battle of the Boyne, and all the banners would say "No surrender." So ever since that time, and ever since Cromwell's time, ever since Queen Elizabeth's time, there was the idea of the plantation of individuals in Northern Ireland and taking out the people who lived there. And there were two sayings. One was either go to Connacht or go to hell, or go to Barbados or go to hell, because either you went or you were killed. That's all there was to it. So this is not something that was new. The North was by far the most industrialized area. The Industrial Revolution, I think one can say, really it blossomed in Great Britain at the time. Everything from steam engines to locomotives, etc. That was the part of Ireland in the North that benefited from that. Yes, they had linen and they made it into cloth. Yes, Harland Wolff was a shipyard that made the Titanic. And from that point of view, this was very important. If you go around Belfast, for example, they have a beautiful new, I don't know if you were there, a beautiful new Titanic museum, for example. It's extraordinary. It's absolutely a marvelous place to go. But if you go there and you talk to somebody in Belfast and you go to a pub, they'll raise a pint and say, and they will say, she was fine when she left here. So the idea of the North is entirely different than the agrarian South, and it was at that time. The maintaining of the North probably had more to do with the idea of the Unionists in the North wanting to stay with Great Britain than Great Britain wanting them. In 1912, there was actually what's called the Guerilla mutiny. The Guerilla was the biggest British military camp in Ireland, and in fact, they were starting to gather arms in the North to fight against the British, and the British Army and the Guerilla, the officers said, we will resign rather than fighting in the North against the people there. And this is such a strange paradox. The Northern Volunteers were established to fight, to stay in the British Empire. You've probably never heard of an army that's established to fight to stay in an empire. The Irish Republican volunteers in the South were established for home rule. So it's a very strange kind of a thing very often. And that was one of the reasons when I was walking around with the books in 1998, 1999, I had a hard time trying to figure out who was on which side and where, because you don't very often read history of somebody trying to gather an army so we can stay in your empire as opposed to leaving.
That's actually fascinating because that goes back to our American Revolution. You had more people in New York City at the time that actually wanted to stay part of the British Empire, and that's the other thing that I found fascinating about Northern Ireland, and specifically around where the Troubles took place, because we did one of those tours while we were there, and it was very eye-opening. But the guy, you got the walled kind of neighborhood where the Irish are, and then all outside it is the kind of the Irish, but they're that are pro Britain. And he said we kind of were on a high ground. He said, look over. He said, look at all the look at that spot right over there where all they are is their Union Jack flags. And he said, notice how there aren't any Irish flags there. And he said, the answer was because those people are English who are over here. The people who are Irish don't feel like they have to wave a flag because they are in Ireland. And I thought that was fascinating. But that's one of those kind of underlying things. And from what I understand, and maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, and it could be the 12th of July parade, but isn't that, or what's the parade where they actually open up the walls and they let the Catholics come out and march kind of down the street, and that inevitably stirs up the animosity up there. But it seems like that's still a very heavy underlying current up there.
Since the Good Friday Agreement in 1998, things have really calmed down tremendously. It must be said to that. The Good Friday Agreement has really helped things along. But there is a tremendous amount of carryover between the loyalists and the Republicans, the Irish on one side, those who want to stay in the British, Great Britain on the other side. It even goes down to the names. It's not Catholics versus Protestants. It hasn't been Catholics versus Protestants really since King Billy or something, since 1690. Basically, the Protestants were the class that had all of the power, had all the jobs, had all of the council seats and that sort of a thing. But even if you looked at it during the Troubles in the 1970s and 80s, this wasn't a religious war by any stretch of the imagination. The people went to church probably only for weddings and funerals, and that was about it. Maybe baptisms on once in a while, but that was it. The fact of the matter is, wherever you went and you saw a great many Union Jacks in the Unionist area, if you had looked around someplace else, you would have seen a tremendous number of Irish flags someplace else. You don't have to look up. You can look down, because you'll see the curbs have red, white, and blue in them, or the curbs were painted green, white, and orange on them. The places are completely separate. The Falls Road, for example, is a Catholic, a nationalist area. The Shankill Road is a Protestant, a Unionist area, and it goes back and forth by this. But the fact of the matter is, it's not as nearly as much as it was. It's still there, and there is some conflict. And now with Brexit, that conflict has come right to the fore again, because the Irish people all were in the EU, as was Great Britain. Ireland is still going to be in the EU, but Great Britain is leaving. So the question is, they had an open border for people to go across, for goods to go across, for service to go across. What's going to happen to that border? That's going to be decided in the next 6 weeks, supposedly. We really don't know, but it's a great, great problem that's come up here. Borders always cause problems, and borders, if you have one law on one side of the border and another law on the other side of the border, wherever that border is and whatever the law is, people will go to the side that gives them the best advantage. Borders are smugglers' delights.
And what do you think? And that's actually fascinating. You heard a few years ago, the Scottish were starting to kind of pipe up about independence from Great Britain. What is going to happen, do you think? If Brexit goes down, are they going to go ahead and put up walls all around Northern Ireland, or?
If you would give me your wallet, I wouldn't be able to go down to a bookie and bet it, because I just don't know. And I think I would say to you that anybody who says that they have a real good idea what's going to happen is probably just blowing smoke. I think there's going to be a Brexit agreement. I don't think everybody's going to like it. I think there are going to be more customs requirements going back and forth between the North, the South, the North Ireland and Britain, and that sort of thing. Scotland did have a referendum. I believe it was about 10 years ago. I'm not sure, but it was some time ago. And it was relatively close. It was in the 50s to the 48s, that kind of a thing. They now say that they'll try and do the same thing and go from there. There are major problems with this. Just the idea of, what are you going to do with money? What are you going to do with public debt? What are you going to do with all the kinds of things that go along with where we are right now? What are you going to do with pensions? Who's going to pick up those kinds of things? It's not as easy to separate as it is not to separate. It's the kind of thing where you look at it and you say, I don't know what's going to happen. And I think with the EU and the Brexit, this may very well be a situation where there is an agreement, but there will be changes to that agreement as time goes on, and people see what happens, and they'll see if there isn't a better way.
Oh, that's fascinating. So we're
don't
seeing,
bet on it, and don't take my word for anything.
we're seeing it play out in real time, which is fascinating. So let's take it back then. So let's go back. Now we're in 1921, the War of Independence, and then you said right after that there was a civil war. And then did things kind of calm down? Because then, at least kind of the way I would envision it, not knowing much about that interim history between, kind of call it the 1920 to like 1970, that kind of 50-year block. What was Ireland like during that time? Was it still pretty? Was there still that kind of animosity towards the English throughout that entire time?
It's not just the animosity toward the English, Brian. It's probably much deeper than that. The War of Independence was 1919 and 1921. There was a truce in July of 1921. Then the Anglo-Irish Agreement came along in December of 1921. The Irish voted on that in June of 1922. And then in June of 1922, there started a civil war. These were the people, the war was on the one side, it was the pro-treaty forces. Those who wanted the treaty said, this is as good as we're going to get right now. Michael Collins thought it was a stepping stone. This is a freedom to achieve freedom. We're going to go from here and we'll be okay. On the anti-treaty side, those are the people who said, no, we fought for a republic. All the people who died, what happened to those? We fought for them. We're not going to take just a partial change at this time. We want everything. There was that civil war, 1922 to 1923, which was horrific. All civil wars are just terrible. But in this one, it wasn't even a case of people were separated. These were the people who went out on operational missions together in the military together. These are people who slept together. These are people who fought and were in the same units, and half the unit went one way and half the unit went another way. And then they were fighting each other the very next day. It was an absolutely horrific period of time. And the animosity that was there was not really against the British at the time. The animosity was against the Irish versus Irish kind of thing. You know, we talk about here brother versus brother in civil wars, and I think most civil wars use that phrase. Certainly we do in the United States. This was civil war of sister versus sister sometime. You know, I talked a little about the women, for example. One of the Ryan sisters married the man who was the head of the Irish army in the South, the Free State Army, and the other Ryan sister married a man who was on the anti-treaty side. It's hard to imagine the kinds of things that would go along that. We are doing this interview 2 days before Thanksgiving. They don't have Thanksgiving in Ireland, but they have Christmas dinners in Ireland. Can you imagine the Christmas dinners where you have one side is pro-treaty and the other side is anti-treaty? For years and years and years, in the 40s and the 50s and the 60s, the people who were on both sides were the ones who were in the Dáil, the Irish Parliament. They were the ones who came back. And they would be walking down the halls of the Irish Parliament, not talk to one another, and move around to the other side so they wouldn't have to see one another. There was a man just 2 days ago, for example, we had the 100-year commemoration of what was Bloody Sunday in Ireland, a terrible time. There were 14 British officers killed in the morning, and there were 14 Irish killed who went to a GAA football match that afternoon. It just absolute terror on both sides. And it was a reprisal, and the British just drove into the park and then started shooting and killed people, including one of the players. But you look at this and you say, all right, now, when I was going to go to a football match in 1930, that occurred in 1920. In 1930, every time I heard a car backfire, every time I heard a plane go over, was this something else? Should I worry about this? Because that was the nature of the things that are going on there. One of the people who was on one of the units that went out to kill the British in the morning was Sean Lemass. Sean Lemass became Taoiseach, that is the Prime Minister of Ireland in the 1950s. So this did not stop. And there were many times when they tried to get together, but it just didn't work. It wasn't an animosity in the South against the British. It was this pro-treaty versus anti-treaty. And then, of course, when you go to Northern Ireland, there were terrible pogroms up there where the British, they had started what were called the B Specials. This was a sort of a volunteer vigilante army, if you will, that would go straight after the Catholics in the area. And it was a horrible time during the whole period of time. In the North, you have the Prime Minister in the North who would say, the North is a Protestant country for Protestants, period. Catholics had no rights. Catholics couldn't get jobs. Catholics couldn't get housing. They couldn't do anything. When did this end? Well, I'll tell you. I belong to a golf club in the north of Ireland, in Port Stewart. I know the man up there who runs the bar very, very well. And he's Protestant. He's married to a Catholic. His wife's sister sometimes comes up, and they go out for a girls' night out. And he will say, Her name is Aoife, which is a very Irish name. When they go out for girls' night out in the north, her name is Lily.
Really?
Yeah. So this is not the kind of a thing that was before 1998 and the Good Friday Agreement. Don't get me wrong. It's changed. It's changed for the better. There's peace. But, always a but.
Yeah, that's fascinating, because that was one of the things and immediately the first thing that comes to mind when you're talking about Belfast and Northern Ireland is Protestant for Protestants only. You know, you can start to kind of see or kind of make that parallel between the Palestinians in Israel right now. You know, and there's those hardcore Palestinians and Hezbollah that don't want anything to do with the Israelis. They're interlopers on their land. They're going to do whatever it takes to get rid of them, and that's kind of what the IRA was doing, at least in the kind of the 70s and the 80s. So that kind of dark window throughout the sort of the World War II, kind of into the Cold War era for the rest of the world. I didn't realize it was still that much of a boiling pot up there.
It's not boiling. It's warm on the stove. It probably wouldn't take very much to get it to boil, but the Good Friday Agreement, I must underscore, has been tremendous. Remember, in the Second World War, Ireland, the Republic of Ireland, was neutral. It did not join in, although a great many Irish men did join the British Army and fought it. It was a rather strange neutrality. There were, for example, at the start of the war, if a German plane happened to crash in Ireland, then the Germans were taken into custody. If a British plane crashed in Ireland, then the British crew was allowed to walk back up to the north of Ireland. However, as the war went on, Ireland really tried to protect its neutrality, and they would keep people in very, very small camps, but they would allow them to go out to pubs and that sort of thing. Even the camps on both sides would play soccer, football back and forth and that sort of thing. So it was not the kind of prisoner of war camps you see anywhere else. But Ireland was neutral. However, they did start to have an attempted bombing campaign in England, trying to do this. One of the men who led that, it was called Campaign S, or S Campaign, was a man by the name of Seamus O'Donovan. James O'Donovan was a chemistry student at UC Dublin, University College Dublin, in 1920, who was making bombs for the IRA for Michael Collins. So it's a kind of thing where you see the history, and it doesn't just stop at one point. Unlike the American Revolution, where an awful lot of the people that you mentioned earlier were loyalists and did in fact move to Canada, did in fact move back to Britain. That did not happen in this particular case. There was a great many people who, because of the Civil War, still maintained conflict all the way through the period of time.
Wow, yeah, fascinating. Kind of taking a quick jump back to the book, The Shadow War, it talks about, and a couple of things that really stuck in my mind when I was reading it was some of the tactics that they were using, and that kind of all sort of follow-on insurgencies and guerrilla style warfare utilized. And the one that really caught my eye was, because you hear about it all the time now, and that's the Roadside Bombed Ied. And that to me is fascinating that they were doing that back then.
Yeah, when I give lectures, I always just talk about insurgencies, and I say they're all different, but they're all the same. Certainly the terrain, for example, in Iraq is different than the terrain in Afghanistan, which is different than the terrain in Ireland, which is different than the terrain in Cuba, Algeria, wherever you want to go. But in many ways, a lot of the things are the same. The very first roadside bomb, attempted a roadside bomb, was actually in 1805. It was thrown at Napoleon. So this is, again, it's not something that's brand new, but it was relatively new. The Irish War was probably the first modern war, a guerrilla war, probably because of the material that was used. It was the first war in which mechanized vehicles were used. Again, if you consider there being a problem in Dublin in 1900, and you'd get 10 troops, you'd line them up, maybe the officer would be on a horse, and you want to go out 5 miles outside of Dublin, it'd take you 2-3 hours to get there. In 1920, it would take you 15 minutes. So they had to do something because of the mechanized, the lorries that they had, and the lorries became up armored, as the term is now. They would put on half-inch armor, which would prevent handguns from going through them, or 1-inch armor, which would prevent from long weapons from going through. But they did start out with the IED, and it was the first war in which they were really used in the way that they're used now. And if you take a look now, you can tell me, but if you take a look now at Afghanistan and Iraq, some of the counter tactics are the same. Drive very fast, don't slow down. Now, clearly the Irish had very poor kinds of explosives. They were using gelignite, which is a sort of dynamite, which doesn't work very, very well. It's certainly not the same as Semtex, but it will blow you up if you're not careful with it. They used electronic, or electric, I should say, detonators, the kind where you lift up and push down, you've got the 2 wires. They would dig a trench in the road, kind of bury it over and hope they do this. They learned, for example, that the British lorries were supposed to stay 300 meters apart. So they would set 2 bombs 300 meters apart, try and catch both at the same time. Exactly the same kind of thing that you see again here in Iraq, that sort of a thing. They did not have cell phone detonators. They were using those electric detonators, but the electric detonators worked fine. Not as well, though, as a cell phone detonator, because you couldn't depend upon them that very, very much. Also, when you buried everything in a road like that, you did have a problem with whether it was going to get wet, whether it was going to be water, if you had to wait for a while, and that sort of thing. You couldn't put it in. But the concept of using that to slow down was used extensively by Che Guevara. It's used extensively in Iraq. It's used everywhere. And all of a sudden, everybody in the world now knows the concept of IED. They know what that is. They know what the concept is, and it's still the same as it was there in 1921.
Yeah, like you were just saying, they do that. Then the other side comes up with some counter tactics, and then the other side goes back and tries to shuffle it up a little bit more, and so it's just going back and forth. And that kind of gets back to one of your main points of this book, and that is
let me just interject here for one second and say something. There was a very famous writer about guerrilla war, and it's exactly the point that you make. One of his lines was, "If it works, it's obsolete."
Yeah, you can't the planning. They also say, especially in major armies, when they go to war, they're basically fighting the last war that they had, and that's why you see the rising importance of the special ops on the U.S. side to help kind of counter that, to kind of get down and start playing the same game as those little groups, because like you mentioned in the book, the insurgency or the guerrilla, the end goal is not to win militarily, because you just can't. The end goal is to hold your own and do as much not only physical damage, but also propaganda damage to the other side, so that they just basically say, listen, we've had enough, it's time to move on, we can't sustain this sort of slow bleed type of a thing. Both slow bleed, both physically, literally and figuratively, the slow bleed of the public support for whatever's going on. And I think, that you see that in a big way currently in both our conflicts, both Iraq and Afghanistan. I mean, just the political concept right now of trying to get our troops out of there. You can see that causing all sorts of, on both sides, you see that causing all sorts of arguments, both for and against keeping the troops there. So yeah, it's I find that fascinating. But the intelligence gathering, how far away are the lorries when they go down the road? What are those tactics? I mean, talk about that, because that was one of the main things that Collins was so good at, was setting up that intelligence apparatus.
He was very good. Again, get back just a second for the guerrilla. Guerrilla wars are always wars of attrition, and they're wars of exhaustion, just as you say. We want to make sure the other person wants to leave. We can't beat them, but we can get them out of here if they do that. T.E. Lawrence of Arabia, you many people study him in the Middle East now. You know, what he did in the Middle East is not exactly what they think. It didn't exactly set a paradigm for war in the Middle East, but he did write some beautiful things, and he was an excellent, excellent writer. One of the things he said was, fighting a guerrilla war is sloppy. It's like eating soup with a knife. And it is. It's just flat difficult, and it's very, very hard to do it. It doesn't make a difference if it's 1921, 2021. It's very, very hard to do it. Let me move on just a second then to intelligence. Collins had a very good idea of intelligence. Number one, when you mentioned earlier about the British being in Ireland since 1200, a great many of the battles that they fought, that the Irish fought and lost, they lost because of informers, because the British had people inside it. Collins made sure that was not going to happen. Collins was taken into Dublin Castle early on. I'm sorry, he was not taken into, he was taken into the police station on Townsend Street, not Dublin Castle as it says in the movie. And he saw what the British had and how the British were putting together their files and what they were doing. And he determined to set up that kind of an intelligence gathering organization for the Irish. Even today, military intelligence is the very same as it was then. It's acquisition, analysis, execution, and counterintelligence. That's it. It's the same things that you always have. Execution, not meaning killing necessarily, but what do we do with this information that we now have? And that's where Collins was extraordinary in terms of it. He was able to put all this together. He did so by using every means that was possible. He had spies in the British offices. He had people who worked for them. He had his cousin, for example, worked in Dublin Castle decoding messages. He had a lady by the name of Molly O'Reilly. She was only 15 years old in the Rising. She came back and she worked for Collins in the clubs, because when the British officers were going to clubs, they take off their weapons and they leave their coats and they take everything out of their coats. He used the women extensively. He used people in hotels. It was said that you could never have a telephone call in a hotel without somebody listening in. He used people on railroads. He used people on ships. He used people everywhere. They had an extraordinary intelligence system. The British did not have that. And as a result, they were kind of behind. The British did not use that covert acquisition of intelligence very well. They were more of the overt acquisition of intelligence. We'll have a raid, we'll get documents, we'll see what's in the documents, and we'll go on another raid and we'll get more. So they both at the end were doing very, very great, very, very well in the war. The Irish were probably head in the middle, and then at the end they were probably about the same. But Collins deserves a lot of credit for the concept of intelligence in a guerrilla war.
Yeah, and I also, hence the subtitle of the book, he comes across as a very interesting character to me, because what they call him, in prison they called him the big fella or something like that. And so so right there, that kind of gives you, hey, he's a big, and I'm not going to say this but
no, that's an interesting story with that. His family always said, remember, Michael Collins was the 7th child. He was the last child in a family. His father was 65, who married a 22-year-old woman, and his father was about 85 when he died. He only knew his father for about 6 or 7 years before he passed away. But his sisters always said that they called him the big fella, because even though as a little tiny kid, he was always trying to pick up the heaviest pail from the cow that got milk, or he was trying to go along with his father to work. That may or may not be true. The real story is that when he was in prison in Frongach, people called him the big fella, not because he was a big man physically. He was an average size, or a little bigger than an average size man, but because he was, I guess the American phrase would be too big for his britches. He was the kind of man who would always stick in your face, always be there, and they didn't like that in some ways. He was the kind of man who would never lose a race. If he was going to be in a race with you, he would cheat. If you started to win, he would cheat. He was that kind of a man. And that carried over in a great many ways when he was a politician and in the cabinet. If he saw something needed to be done, he got it done. Then, unfortunately, he would go to the cabinet meeting, say to the cabinet minister, whose brief this really was, well, so-and-so, I did that for you because you're not doing a very good job.
Yeah.
So in many ways, he was looked upon and loved and admired, and just, he was idolized by the people who worked for him. There were a great many, though, who did not like him because of his personality.
And that sort of bombastic, not backing down, we'll drop the gloves and we'll start fighting. Obviously, that played well for him during the Rising and the War of Independence, because it sounded. I didn't get the impression that he was a sociopath in the sense of how he used violence. But he used it, and he used it very effectively. And he had people that you would typically call a sociopath or very dangerous criminal type people. Talk a little bit about that, because it seems like in all these type of conflicts, there has to be somebody that somebody looks up to as a leader, but who also has to give that call for the dirty work to happen as well.
Well, it's always said that one shouldn't speak ill of the dead, but hell, in Ireland, if you didn't do that, you'd eliminate about half your conversation. So I don't think there's going to be a particular problem here. There are people who were involved in this who would have fit in very, very well with Al Capone. There were people who talked about the fact that they liked shooting British soldiers. There were others who used terror, understood terror, wanted to use terror, and didn't even think a thing about it. There are a great many people who suffered as a result of that. Not just the people upon whom the terror was committed, but the people who actually committed themselves. Later on in their lives, they had real problems with that. In World War I, we first started looking at what they then called shell shock, which was then called battle fatigue in World War II, which we now call PSTD. And really, there weren't that many people who were diagnosed with this. But as we now look at PSTD, and we look at the people coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan, and we see the studies, we can clearly see that there are a great many people who probably had one form of another of PSTD and that sort of thing. I was on a panel one time with a professor, a university professor, and I was talking about this, and he decried it. He said, no, that's not true. He said, we don't even know how many of the black and tans fired a shot in the First World War. And my point to him was, it probably is more important how many of the black and tans had a shot fired at them in the First World War than it would be how many fired a shot. Because the terror that goes along with the war, that's there all of the time, and the terror not just of the soldier, not just of the intelligence agent, not just of the person walking the street, but there's a feeling of terror throughout the whole of Dublin, the whole of Cork. You're going to be stopped. Am I going to be stopped on the road by somebody who's a British agent who's looking in my pockets for something? Am I going to be stopped on the road by an Irish Republican who's been looking in my pockets for something? It's a terrible kind of a thing to put up with. And that terror they had was there throughout the time. And yes, you're absolutely right, some of them. As far as Collins is concerned, Collins said about terror, it was the only way for a small nation to fight a great empire. And it probably is. And it probably is again today. And we take a look at terror today, and it's very difficult to define. In the new book, The Terror War, I spent a lot of time trying to define it. There are military definitions, there are political definitions, there are legal definitions, there are philosophical, ethical definitions. It's very, very hard to define terror. Let me give you one example. We often think of assassination as terror. All right, maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But ethicists will look at assassination and they'll say, if a war can be moral and a war can be legal, is it less moral or less legal to send somebody to kill one person instead of thousands? Very, very difficult question to answer. Terror is there all the time. It's intimidation. It's fear. It's a kind of thing that it does not go away. It can be just around the corner. It can be that man going to the GAA football match the next year saying, if I hear some loud sound, is this the same terror I saw 100 years ago, 2 days ago? Terror just invades the whole process.
Yeah, and that usually the vast majority of people that aren't involved in those activities somehow seem to get caught up in it in terms of collateral damage and that sort of thing. And you know that as you're talking about that, my mind immediately goes to the Europa Hotel in Belfast. That being when we were over there, they said that's got the international claim to fame as being the most bombed hotel in the world. I mean, how would you, if let's say you're on a business trip and your boss says, "Yeah, we're staying at the Europa," you'd be like, "Oh my God, this could be it." But yeah, I mean, that's the definition of terror. It's supposed to make you.
Terror makes you change your life.
Yep.
Terror intimidates you. It may or may not ever happen, but terror makes you so afraid that you want to do that. There's no Chinese proverb that says victory is not going to the one who kills the most, but the one who frightens the most. And if you can do that, if you can make sure that everybody is so frightened that everything they do, they'll stop doing even things which would probably be okay, but they're just terrified. That's where the word comes from. And terror was prevalent during this whole period of time.
Yeah, and reading the book and then kind of, then thinking about America's Vietnam War and then thinking about Iraq and Afghanistan, the steps all seem to be the exact same. So the rebels or the insurgents or the guerrillas do something horrific. They keep doing that. It builds up the occupying forces sense of we got to crush these people. They go out and do something maybe so over the top as to actually start to turn public opinion away from what it's viewed as so much more barbaric than what they had happened to them that it actually starts to work against them. Their counter tactics start to work against them in terms of the populace's desire to keep going in those wars.
Reprisals generally come by design. They actually came by design in Ireland. The Irish would know that if we're going to do something, there will be a reprisal. The reprisal will be reported. It will be worse than everything. It's very, very difficult and different to fight a guerrilla war in a democracy than it is in a totalitarian government. A totalitarian government, they don't care. They don't have a press. They don't care what happens, and it doesn't make any difference. And the people don't object because they can't object. In a democracy, the people do object. They don't want those things happening. They don't want that. And all of a sudden, they lose the, quote, the battle of the narrative in today's terms. They lose that concept of propaganda. When that goes down that road, it's very difficult. The Irish knew that they were going to do things which were going to cause the reprisals, and the reprisals were going to be far worse, far more disproportionate than the action of the Irish, and they knew that was going to work to their advantage. Again, this is a strategy. It's a tactic. It was used then, and it's used now, and it's completely used. And if you take a look at these things, whether you take a look at Mao, who did that, if you look at, you mentioned Vietnam, and of course, Vietnam is a great shame for the United States. You take a look at Ho Chi Minh. Ho Chi Minh was actually a dishwasher in London at the time of the Irish War of Independence. So you take a look at these, and they learn, terrorists learn, revolutionaries learn, guerrillas learn. They use, you said we fight the last war, they do. They learn what was useful in the last war, we use that for the next war. We adapt it, we change it, and then if it works, we adapt it again. If it doesn't work, we try something else. But they're constantly changing. They have the upper hand in the sense that they're the ones who are always on the aggressive. They're the ones who are always out there in front. Most of the major states, Britain, for example, in that case, the United States in some of the recent cases, they're fighting in a defensive war. They try to fight a defensive war, but they're actually out there defensive war. And the guerrillas always are out in front. They're always the aggressors. They're always the ones who are going to do that.
And correct me if I'm wrong here in my reading of this. It got the Irish, obviously the general Irish population, they didn't necessarily support the violence, but the reprisals were such that they actually started to go behind or support what Collins was doing. And so hence he knew that, yeah, I'm going in there, I'm going to do this XYZ, and we're going to get reprisals. But he also knew that, I guess, the Irish population kind of had his back in the sense that they were all going to take it as one group, as opposed to starting to turn away from Collins, as in terms of blaming him for that. Is that, am I accurate in saying that, or is that?
I think it's very difficult to make generalizations. Most of the time, the people hated the violence, always. People everywhere hate violence. They would just assume that people of violence would go off someplace and fight among yourselves or something. They hate this. And that's in the case of wars today as much as wars then. In the Irish War, what happened is the British came in, and the British tried to put on these reprisals, and they basically forced the Irish to move and leave and join flying columns and go away from home beyond the run and that sort of thing. But some of the Irish would say to the IRA, we know you've been here. We know you've been observing that lorry going by here every day at noon. We know you're planning to attack that. If you attack that lorry, the British will come back here tonight and burn our homes, our businesses, and our creamery. Don't do that. Sometimes the Irish would leave, and sometimes they didn't. Again, it's a process of terror. It changes people's lives. Other times, they knew what was going on, and they didn't. There's a very famous case of a lady who turned in, and her name escapes me right now. I'll think of it in a second. Who turned in some people who were going to have an ambush, and she was actually captured by the Irish. Her name was Mary Lindsay. She was captured by the Irish, and they said, she told that there was going to be an ambush. Our people were killed and are captured. If you don't let them loose, we will kill her. And the British did not, and the Irish did kill her. So it was a situation where, again, the terror is there on both sides. If you think, if I'm turning somebody in, and if I'm going to get caught turning somebody in, I'm going to get executed, you're probably not going to turn them in.
And that actually a very interesting experience that I had in Iraq, and I'd be interested to get your take on this. And I'll give you my real quick take. But the first deployment that we were over there, we on the base. So the coalition had taken over a bunch of old Iraqi airfields. So we're in the middle of the desert by the three big lakes that you see in the middle of the country. There's a big lake called Lake Habaniah, and there's a big airfield there. So that's where I flew out of. And when I first got there, there was actually, there's a tent city, then there's the airfield, and then there's kind of a little area around where the chow hall is, where you had little stores, and the civilians would actually come up. They'd have to get vetted, obviously, that they were going to be safe. But there were several small little kiosks where some of the Iraqi civilians from the little villages just outside the airbase would come up every day. And it was a bustling little area. You can get some tea, you can buy some trinkets, that sort of thing. And that went on until one day it stopped. One day they just never showed up again. And 2 weeks later, basically the whole little area was torn down. And what I heard was I want to say it was Al Qaeda. It's escaping me. But the insurgents figured out who was going up there. And so they would wait at the end of the road that took you up to the base main gate. They would wait there, and they were killing those people off for going up and actually essentially aiding and abetting the enemy. Whereas I would have thought in a kind of more classical sort of insurgents guerrilla war, that would have been the ideal intelligence gathering group that was actually on that base every day. And yet they killed them off. And so that whole activity on the base by the general population of the Iraqis completely stopped. And it was sad to hear that. But, that's, again, like you said, it's a terror war.
In terms of intelligence, still to this very day, we talk about satellite intelligence. Everybody's listening on your phone. Everybody knows that. If you don't think the NSA is listening, well, they are. But all those sorts of things. The absolute best intelligence is still human intelligence. It always is going to be human intelligence. The young boy who was selling newspapers out in front of Dublin Castle, and he would know that the collar tabs of a new British regiment were in town. And he'd say, "Oh, now I can tell this to the Collins people." The lady who's selling meat pies, as you suggest, in the back, and some of the black and tans say, "Mrs., you got the best meat pies around. I hope they have good ones in Limerick too, because that's where we're heading." Boom. This is the kind of information you get. But if you don't get that information, then you don't want the people going there. And in your particular example, I'm not going to say, because I would have no idea, but I would suggest to you that if they did not feel that their information was more valuable than the people going there and getting involved, then they figured they'd kill them instead of having them go there and give the money in. But information like that is the absolute best information you can ever get.
Yeah, and I agree with you. I think that's probably what happened, and it's sad, but that's just the reality of the situation. It just seemed to me, and I think again, kind of going back to this idea of a community of citizens kind of rallying around a cause. At that point, at that point in the war, if I remember correctly, there was a lot of foreign fighters pouring into Iraq to fight the coalition. And so they may not even have been Iraqis, so they didn't even care about those civilians. So it was more like those civilians were in the way. We don't need necessarily to worry about them, cull that herd, get them over in the corner, just gotta stay away from us type of thing, which is another, that's, I don't even know where that would fall into the whole counterinsurgency once you start bringing in people outside.
Guerrilla war, insurgency, terror war, it's horrific. And it must be understood that it's horrific on both sides. In this new book, The Terror War, for example, I try to outline how it was done by both sides. It's well known that the black and tans from time to time would capture someone, would tie them by their ankles to a lorry and then drag them through the streets until they were just dismembered and dead. That's horrific. That's terror. And that's certainly going to intimidate anybody else. That's an awful kind of a thing to do. The Irish in County Kilkenny once found out that there was a man who was giving information to the British. The officer in command determined that if we shoot him, the British will hear the shot, so we can't do that. So they simply bound his hands and his feet, attached a 56-pound weight to him, and threw him in a river. That's horrific. I cannot quantify, I cannot qualify terror. Terror is absolutely horrific on both sides. And it's horrible when it's one person or 100 people. That terror is just absolutely there in people's minds. And each side is going to say, well, the other side did and this side didn't. No, our lives, our worlds, our relationships, nothing we have is binary. Nothing is black and white. We did, they don't. It doesn't work that way. We did it and so did they. They did it and so do we. Hair shearing, cutting the women's hair off, was done by both sides. It was done with the intent of both sides to make sure the woman stuck out that either she had been associating with the British or she was giving information to the Irish. One or the other. It doesn't make any difference. They both did it. They both did it intentionally, and it was just as horrific for one side as it was for the other.
That's a pleasant thought, Joe. But it's the reality of the situation. So the 10 books you wrote, you sound like you got quite an expertise on this whole concept of violence in a guerrilla war. Is that kind of was that your intent when you started writing these books, or did it just sort of kind of work your way into, hey, this is, to the point where that's a subject for a whole entire book on itself?
It more or less worked into it in the sense that I think in talking to the people, giving a lot of lectures over the years, I have talked to people and said, this is what happened here and this is what happened here. But afterwards, sometimes the question and answer periods are the most important for me, because people will ask questions. Did I say something? And they will say, well, yeah, but we didn't do that, or the Irish didn't do that. But yes, they did. And so it's very important, I think, to try and go back. You take a look at the book that you're talking about, the Shadow War, then you take a look at what I hope will be the new book, the Terror War. And what you find is similar things that happen all the time. Countries always say, we will not negotiate with terrorists. Countries always negotiate with terrorists. They either do it sub rosa, and then they bring it out into the open to come to the peace talks, and they'll say, well, these people are no longer terrorists. They have determined they're going to go down the peace process. But while the negotiation is going on, they will call them terrorists, murderers. They'll call them everything that you can imagine. This is the kind of thing that I think I try to do in the new book. I try to get away from the binary construct of this is right, this is wrong, we did this, they did that. I try to show that, in fact, war is just flat dirty. And in fact, it's going to be dirty on both sides. And you just hope that your side is going to see some morality, some little better actions than the other side. But you're going to see, if you study any war at any given time, you are going to see things on both sides that are just going to shock you. Let's take a look just at a couple more. Remember, I did go to law school, and going to law school is great for giving you all kinds of really terrible ideas, and I guess I have exacerbated that. But you take a look at the British and the French and Indian Wars, they gave blankets to the Indians that were infected with smallpox. If you take a look at, there was a man named Rains, a Colonel Rains, in the Seminole Wars in Florida in the early 1800s, and we talked earlier about IEDs. You have IEDs in Iraq where they would be buried inside of a dead dog by the street. So somebody would go over and grab the dog. He would bury explosives inside the bodies of the dead Indians, and when they were killed, and their tribe would come to get them and take them away, they would blow them up. So these kinds of things happen all the time on both sides, and they just have to be accepted. When we send people out to kill, we have to understand that human nature is going to be problematic in that killing.
And unfortunately, it happens to be very effective in what its ultimate aims to do.
It is. It is. One thing about guerrilla war is it doesn't kill as many as mass bombings. It doesn't kill as many as blanket bombings and things of this type. It doesn't kill as many as were killed in the First World War by any means. It does not do that. That's not to suggest that we should all go to guerrilla wars and get rid of the other ones. It's not by any means. But we have to understand what the war is and what it does and how it's prosecuted. And guerrilla wars, like I say, they're all the same, but they're all different.
And that's a tough ask for populations of human beings that are, generally speaking, peace-loving people and family-loving people. That's a tough ask to get them to get their heads around it. You need, something, and we don't have to go into this, but something has to be triggered in them to cause them to be on board with what potentially is about to happen, or else there wouldn't be any political will to do that.
Well, political will is, guerrillas are going after political will. They're not going after military will. They're trying to attrit your political will to fight. And very often the wars that win, guerrilla wars that win, that's what they've done. Most guerrilla wars of the 20th and unfortunately 21st century now have lost. But the ones that have won have understood the concept of military action, but politics and propaganda combined with intelligence can make you succeed. Not necessarily win, but they can make you succeed in some of the things that you want to have and go from there. But politics, as you suggest, Brian, politics is the most important thing, and propaganda is basically how you put together the politics.
Yeah, it's interesting. When we were in Vietnam last year and traveling up in North Vietnam in Hanoi, our guide, this was a bizarre experience. Especially being a U.S. combat vet, to hear our young guide, who was probably maybe in his 30s, maybe his 30s, and basically saying, we're glad that you guys are here. It's okay, don't worry about the fact that you lost. We're still glad that you're coming here. And it was just so bizarre to hear that, but that was a win for them, and their entire population feels that way.
Yeah, it is. I mean, I'd never talk about who won. I talk about who succeeded. Because winning is the kind of thing that you get maybe in the First World War, or winning is in the Second World War or something. Guerrilla wars are usually not won. Guerrilla wars are usually finished. And you may succeed in what you're trying to do, or partially succeed, or in some way get some kind of things. Guerrilla wars generally want to get rid of the invader. They want to get rid of the oppressor. They want to change the government. Sometimes that works and sometimes it doesn't. But very often they don't win. And when you have these kinds of things, you still can have animosity that's sub rosa, that's under the surface, and it'll continue for a long period of time until hopefully it goes away.
All right, so I definitely want to get your take on this, because my impression of when they killed Collins, am I right in saying that that's kind of very similar to a mafia hit where it was his own people, or was it the opposite political side that ended up actually doing that at the end of the day?
Collins always said he was a soldier and he was not a politician. I would suggest that he was a little better politician than he thought. I look at him as being a modern day CEO, the kind of person who has his fingers in every kind of a pie someplace. He's got a company that does transmission parts in Singapore and a fruit farm someplace in Jamaica. Collins was not a soldier. He was never a soldier. He was, in fact, in the GPO in the Easter Rising of 1916. He certainly fired a weapon there, but he probably never fired a weapon in the War of Independence. He was not a soldier. He put himself in a position in which he should not have been. There was in the southwest part of Cork at that time, the anti-treaty forces really were all over the place. And what they had done, among other things, is they had trenched the roads, they had blown up bridges and everything. There were very few places, very few roads that you go in and out. He went down there, he went down to Cork. He was on a mission to get some money transferred into the banks. He also was on a mission to talk to various people. Collins was always, like that CEO, wanting to make a deal. He wanted to make a deal to end the Civil War if he could. However, when he went by there, they saw him. And he came back the very same way because it was the only way to come back. The people who saw him knew that he was going to come back that way. Some people suggest that this was a total setup. But think about it. If you have a unit that's going to have your commander go by you and the commander's going to come back and you have the ability to set up ambushes, you don't just set one unless you know that's the only way he can come back. You'd set multiple ambushes. They didn't. They set one. He had to come back that way. The ambush was almost over. It was the end of the day. It was 7:30 at night on August 22nd. He was coming down the road. It was starting to get dark. They came into the ambush area. A shot was fired. He was there with a man named Emmett Dalton, who had fought in the First World War in the trenches. And Dalton told the driver of the car, "Go like hell." And Collins said, "No, we'll get out and fight." Collins did. Again, he not only was that a very poor military kind of thing, he stood up in the middle of a firefight. And he was standing up in the middle of the road in the middle of a firefight when somebody who was probably leaving, the last shot they fired, it hit him. He was the only one who was killed. Only one other man was shot through the neck, and it was a very small wound. But Collins was the only one. He was shot by the anti-treaty forces. And the fact of the matter is, though, he put himself in a position where, and again, I'm sure you've seen this, particularly among young second lieutenants or something, they just don't know what they're doing. And when you do the debriefing afterwards, you just shake your head and say, they should never have been in that spot to the first place.
And then tack on top of that, his personality, that hot-headed, just looking for a fight, not thinking anything had happened to him. Wow. And so I wanted to ask, and we're kind of coming up on our time here, but I want to just, because this is very much, I've been thinking about this because, start with the IRA and the more modern history of Ireland in the 70s and the 80s, and then they ceased to. So the IRA started in 1916 with Collins, and then they sort of worked their way through, and then it was kind of the height of their notoriety in the 80s when they were the bombings and all those sorts of things. Did that wing disband in 98 at that agreement, or is it sort of still kind of simmering, waiting for something else to pop up?
Ever since the British came over in 1200, there have been people who have fought. There was the Irish Republican Brotherhood, which was actually a part of the Fenian Brotherhood, started here in the United States in 1858. They were the ones who really had the rising in 1867 and that sort of thing. The Fenian Brotherhood got to be a bunch of old men who were sitting in the pub talking about the things that they did. Remember, among soldiers and among athletes and everything else, the older we get, the better we were. Remember that the fact of the matter is that's exactly what they did. By 1900 and 1905, some new people came along, and people in Belfast actually started to take over the Irish Republican Brotherhood. Collins' father was a member of the Irish Republican Brotherhood. Collins went to school with a teacher who was a member of the Irish Republican Brotherhood. Collins was in a town where the blacksmith was a member of the Irish Republican Brotherhood. And in a small village in those days, after school to go over there and be able to use the bellows and things. This was the greatest place in the world to be. Collins went to London. Collins became a member of the Irish Republican Brotherhood in 1909. And then the Irish Republican Brotherhood really was the one that started the Easter Rising in 1916. Even though they talked about the Sinn Féin Rising, it was done by the people in the Irish Republican Brotherhood. They stayed the same. The Irish Republican Brotherhood were the people who were very involved in the 1919 and 1921 War of Independence. And again now, that it kind of died with Collins. It kind of stopped. It's actually said the Irish Republican Brotherhood was terminated in 1924. It probably was, but it doesn't exist anymore. However, what you had was that animosity between the pro side and the anti-treaty side, and that continued all the way to the 30s and 40s. When you come to the latter half of the 20th century, what you have is still people saying, we are the IRA, we are the descendants of those people. We are the ones who are trying to do this. And in fact, if you take a look at the historiography of 1970, 1980, 1990, there was a tremendous amount of effort on the part of historians to say, oh, no, what they are saying in the North is not true. The people in the South did not use, or people in the Irish War of Independence did not use just terror. They did not use just violence. That's not correct. I think that's incorrect. In fact, they tried to say that the War of Independence was just dictators versus Democrats. No, there were dictatorial things on both sides, including Collins, and Democrats on both sides. So I think when you take a look at the second half, they say this, the provisional IRA, yes, these are the descendants. Probably not. Probably not. Any more than the Democratic Party of the United States is the same Democratic Party as it was in 1932. But they've got the name and that's it. In 1998, they said that's it. The IRA is now gone. We are going to decommission our weapons. The Canadian General Chastain said that their weapons have been decommissioned, but not all the weapons, I don't believe. That's why you still have what are called dissident groups, the real IRA, the continuity IRA. Some of the people who are still around, just like in 1921, who said, we are anti-treaty, we're not going to accept this, we are going to fight. Now you have the continuity who says, we are not going to accept the Good Friday Agreement, we're not going to accept it, we're going to fight. It's still there. It's very, very small. But a small gun can kill somebody just as easily as a large gun. A small bomb is just as devastating as a large bomb.
And that actually is a great way to kind of circle back and close out the interview. Small bomb, small bullet, small gun, if put in the right spot, can spark that terror that will get their point across a lot quicker and a lot more loudly.
Unfortunately, it's true. Was then, is now.
Yep. Well, listen, Joe, this has been a pleasure, man. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'd like to have you back when your next book comes out.
I'd love to. I would. Right. Thank you very much.
Let me finish off by saying, if you're in the military, the police departments, fire departments, or the first responders, if that's you out there, thank you very much for your service. Again, this is Joe Connell, the Shadow War, Michael Collins, and the Politics of Violence. Joe, thank you again for your time.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Brian.
Thanks for watching Rain Man's Take, Observations on the World We Live in. If you like the content, don't forget to hit the subscribe button below. You can also follow Rain Man's Take on Instagram at Rain Man's Take. Also, check out our website at www.rainmanstakepodcast.com and send your comments to rainmanstake@gmail.com. Keep an eye out for future podcasts, which will be coming out every Thursday at 5 p.m. West Coast time.